Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are tackling the Big Four. First published on January 27th, 1927 by, of course, William Collins and Sons in the UK, and later the same year by Dodd Mead in the US. However, it's a little bit trickier than that because the book is actually an edited compilation of a serialized short story collection that ran in, of course, the Sketch magazine between January and March of 1924, and it was called The Man Who Was Number 4. Only to much later, of course, then be compiled with the suggestion and assistance of Christie's brother-in-law, Campbell Christie.
So, yeah, this is an interesting one in terms of the timing. Basically, this book, even though it was published directly after the murder of Roger Ackroyd, was pretty clearly written before the murder of Roger Ackroyd. We know that the short stories that make up the novel were written several years before, but it even seems like the actual compilation of the book itself was potentially done before Ackroyd. And the reason why the timeline gets a little tricky here is that this is around the period when Agatha Christie was going through a really tough personal time. This is when her husband Archie left her for another woman and said he wanted a divorce. She very much did not want to divorce him. Their daughter Rosalind was still very young. This is also when she very famously disappeared for a week, and we promise, going to be covering that in another episode, a little bit out of order in terms of the chronology, but this is the period when that's all happening. So that very special episode will be coming soon. But essentially, once that period was over, which, by the way, also included the death of her mother, she didn't really have the mental wherewithal to start writing another book. So this is why she decided to put out the Big Four. And there's evidence, even though no one's exactly sure, that the Big Four is actually the book that she compiled when she was trying to burn out her Bodley Head contract. And we talked about this earlier when we were going over The Secret of Chimneys. That was, in fact, the last book in her contract, but she mentions in her autobiography how she had kind of slapped together another book, and she knew that it wasn't going to be accepted as one of the books, but that it would burn one of the number that she was under contract in terms of having to offer to them. And she doesn't come out and say that that was the Big Four, but a lot of people think that it was.
But in that scenario, it would actually predate The Secret of Chimneys as well, correct?
The writing of it would predate the writing of The Secret of Chimneys. Yeah, absolutely. So
in other words, the publication history of this and the editing of this and the writing situation of this book are all extremely unusual.
Yes, very, very unusual. Keeping that in mind, that this has this odd this book has this pastiche quality to it where it's a number of short stories patched together. Our synopsis is going to reflect that odd quality because this episode would be 3 hours long if we tried to give a detailed synopsis of every single short story that's patched together here. Suffice it to say that there's an overarching story, which we will go through in a second and give the broad outlines of. And that overarching story is classic Christie thriller, spy sort of adventure plot. Interestingly, this is a Poirot novel. So this is the first time that we've put Monsieur Poirot. This is the first time. A spy novel. Yeah, it's the first time Christie put Poirot in a spy novel. But that overarching story is classic Christie thriller, and then each of the short stories within are little miniature mystery puzzles. And we're going to focus on one of those mystery puzzles and otherwise just sort of take you through the broad strokes of this overarching story.
All right, just the setup of this, which, believe you me, the setup alone is complicated. Captain Hastings is now a successful farmer in Argentina with Cinderella. And he's made a business run to Paris, but then decides that he's going to surprise his dear Monsieur Poirot in London, as it's been a year and a half. And boy, howdy, is Poirot surprised, because he himself was literally walking out the door to take a trip to South America at the behest of Abe Ryland, the American soap king, in part because Ryland offered a ton of money. But I also just want to immediately interrupt because do you think Abe Ryland, the American soap king, is any relation to Ferris Bueller's Abe Froman, the sausage king of Chicago?
Maybe that was inspired by Christie.
I legitimately wondered that. I strongly hope that that's true. Anyway, he was offered all this money, but he also really missed Captain Hastings and wanted to surprise visit him too.
There's a lot of Poirot and Hastings love in this novel, which we will be noting
That's really
throughout.
a nice part of it.
Yeah, it's one of the best parts of this novel, which isn't saying much, but it is one of the best parts. Unfortunately or not, right after their reunion, a man staggers into Poirot's flat and promptly collapses, but not before muttering Poirot's name repeatedly and scribbling the number 4. He also, by the way, has written down Poirot's address, which is given as 14 Fairway, not 28 Whitehaven Mansions, because that is where Poirot moves to later. So this is an early Poirot address, and I was very surprised that it was not Whitehaven Mansions.
I know, shocker.
Shocker. Anyway, the bedraggled man tells our two detectives that there's an international criminal organization, something along the lines of the Illuminati or something equally elaborate and ridiculous, called the Big Four, made up of 4 people. Li Chang-yen, a Chinese political genius, that's number 1. A man who is depicted by a $sign and a bunch of stars and stripes, which means he's either Kesha or an American. Well, I guess Kesha is an American, so an American other than Kesha. That's number 2. Number 3 is known to be a French woman. And number 4 is known as the Destroyer. And
after all of that, and this man is just basically collapsed, they get a doctor to check on the man. And the doctor's like, oh yeah, I'll just check back on him in a few hours. Go on your big South American vacation while this guy is passed out in your flat.
And Poirot's like, okay, yeah, I can't go back on my word. Super important.
Right, to the Soap King. And so Poirot and Hastings head to Southampton. So Hastings is going to see him off, and how Poirot realizes all of a sudden that his sea voyage is actually a ploy to get him out of the way from investigating this massive international conspiracy theory. So they jump off the train, rush back to London, and find, unfortunately, their visitor is deceased, and a gentleman from the lunatic asylum is inquiring about him.
Yeah, and already we're 10 pages into the story, and it's so bizarre because there's no reason why Poirot realizes at the last minute that this is probably conspiracy, which is very un-Poirot-like. Normally, he would be able to understand the situation and what's going on from the get-go, and it's just already there's a tension in this book by stuffing Hercule Poirot into a thriller plot that just never gets resolved, and honestly, at least for me, never really works. And it's just what it does is that it highlights the ridiculousness of these thriller plots. And I seem to be constantly harping on The Man in the Brown Suit as one of the few thrillers that works. But I think part of that is because it is these standalone characters who Christie actually creates very much for the thriller plot, and it works and it fits. And here you get a little bit of a square in a round hole feeling with Poirot dashing about on a train and speaking with lunatic asylum keepers and thinking of things at the last minute. So it's already uncomfortable.
Right, and then to make things even weirder, we have the jumping off the train, the dead man, the lunatic asylum guy. They call up, because they have a corpse in their flat, they call up Inspector Japp. He very casually informs them that, oh, you know what, I totally recognize that dead guy. He's a British Secret Service officer who's been missing for 5 years. And then Poirot realizes that the man was killed by cyanide, and that the gentleman from the loony bin was, in fact, the Destroyer.
Number 4, the Destroyer. So the international conspiracy is on, and Poirot, Hastings, and Japp are all set to unravel this thing. And at this point, things get way more insane. We're going to really gloss over things and just say this. There is a French woman, the number 3 in question, who is named Madame Olivier, and she has a greater mind than Marie Curie and is a French national treasure as a chemical scientist. She is assisted by Countess Rosikoff, who is a previous Poirot nemesis from a short story called The Double Clue. And we'll talk about this a little later when we go over the many, many ways in which this novel is stuck in its own time. But there's a lot of emphasis placed on how brilliant a criminal Countess Rosikoff is. But I am going to push back on that. We can talk about that later. We eventually find out that number 2 is none other than the Soap King Abe Ryland, the American millionaire. Then Hastings essentially gets knocked out a lot. There's a lot of Hastings passing out in this story.
So much. Gets clobbered over the head. He would have to go through so much concussion protocol if this were a sport because, I
mean, if he weren't already a little soft in the head, he certainly would be after this sequence of events. But he gets knocked out, and various henchmen of the Big Four take him back to this lair in Chinatown, and they threaten to torture him unless he lures Poirot to said lair. Hastings, of course, is a gentleman and a soldier, so he caves only when his wife is directly threatened, but even then he manages to warn Poirot at the last minute. Poirot subsequently, by the way, reveals to him that he had Hastings' wife, Cinderella, put into hiding months previously to make sure that she was fine.
Inexplicably.
And inexplicably. Poirot and Hastings are then the victim of an exploding matchbox. I hate when that happens. And upon waking, Hastings is told that Poirot has died. Hastings is, of course, devastated.
Just pause for a moment. I know we're speed summarizing, but Poirot is dead, right? That's Hastings is told he's dead. That is a plot twist in this.
That is a plot twist in this, and also what I was especially annoyed about when that plot twist came about is that Hastings attends Poirot's funeral, and we are told nothing about it. I know that Christie does not really love setting a scene or including much description because she always has another plot point to move on to, and that's fine. I generally love that about her, but come on. It's Hercule Poirot's very public funeral, and the only detail he gives is that there's an incredible number of floral bouquets. That's literally the only detail. A lot of people attend, and there's a ridiculous number of bouquets. And that's it. Well, missed opportunity.
I mean, I guess we learned that Poirot is quite beloved and popular.
I guess. The funeral happens, and everyone tells Hastings that Poirot's died and he should save himself and stop investigating the Big Four and just go back to Cinderella and his life in Argentina. He very pig-headedly refuses until he gets a letter from Poirot himself, having written this with his foresight, knowing that Hastings wouldn't want to go back. Poirot tells him to leave, so he finally does. He gets on a boat only to run into Poirot! Yay! So they're reunited. He wasn't dead after all. And then at that point, they hole up together in the Belgian countryside for a long time. A few months. That's the other thing that's bizarre about this story is the very bloated timeline here. It takes about a year for this story to take place.
Yeah, and also, keep in mind, Captain Hastings has a wife and a successful ranching business in Argentina, supposedly.
I know.
Who's overseeing that or keeping his wife warm when he's holed up in the Belgian countryside?
I couldn't tell you. So they hole up in the Belgian countryside, just the two of them, and eventually the Big Four's machinations become advanced enough that it's time for them to travel to yet another lair. This time it is the secret headquarters of the Big Four in a snowy Italian mountainside, which reminded me of nothing more than Inspector Gadget and Dr. Claw. That is probably only a reference that Americans of a certain age are going to get.
Inspector Gadget. Get
you next time, Gadget. Next time.
By the time they get to this snowy Italian mountainside, there's a big hotel next to the cave where the Big Four are sequestered. They are felled by yet another match. This time they're sitting at a table, and the dreaded number 4/Destroyer uses a match to create another diversion and drags Hastings and Poirot into said lair in the mountainside, except that it isn't Hercule Poirot. It's his hastily mentioned twin brother. Because 20 pages back, Poirot mentioned to Hastings, hey, you know that I have a twin brother, right? And that his name is whatever the French version of Achilles is.
I think it's probably Achille.
This is yet another moment in Christie when she directly references Sherlock Holmes, because Poirot even makes a joke and says, didn't you know that all famous detectives have to have secret, lazy brothers who are actually more brilliant than the world-famous detective? So this is a clear, very winking reference to Mycroft Holmes. And it seems that there's been a switcheroo done so that it's Poirot's twin brother who's now trapped in the cave with Hastings and the Big Four. So Hastings triumphantly tells him that Poirot is actually outside and that the place has been surrounded by police because they knew about this lair all along. And the Big Four are kind of running around trying to deal with this as people seem to be invading the lair. But the clever Countess Rosikoff realizes that actually this is the real Hercule Poirot. And it seems that at that point, all will be lost and poor Poirot and Hastings will finally be offed for real. But Poirot all of a sudden is able to tell the Countess Rosikoff that he can reunite her with her long-lost son, which is literally brought up in that moment. We've never heard about this before.
Who she thinks is dead, basically.
Yeah, she thinks her son is dead, and then he produces a photograph, and she can, I guess, see that it's her son who's older, so he wasn't dead, because Poirot had the foresight to actually look into her past to be able to bribe her with something really meaningful to her if such a situation of being trapped in a cave and needing to get out, ever came up. So it's just insane. But the Countess, she allows Poirot and Hastings to escape. They barely get out before the mountainside blows up, killing 3 of the 4 members of the Big Four. Li Changyan, the number 1, is still in China, but we learn later that he commits suicide. So the Big Four have been defeated, hooray, and Poirot and Hastings will live to see another day. That is actually the story of this Hercule Poirot, quote-unquote, mystery, and it's insane.
I mean, it sounds like every element of it we just made up, and It really felt a little bit like that reading it. I think it seemed like a terrible soap opera plot combined with like Austin Powers.
Yeah. It has a total exaggerated James Bondian Austin Powers, Inspector Gadget kind of feel to it, and it's so heightened because it's Poirot. So I will just point out for me the low point of the novel is this sequence when they're trapped in yet another. We haven't even mentioned this secret lair that they got trapped in, but at some point in the middle of the story when they go to Paris and they're dealing with Madame Olivier, who's number 3.
Oh, that's a secret lair too.
That's a secret lair, and she entraps them, and she is essentially about to kill them, and then Poirot says, could you, before we die, many people are often allowed to smoke a cigarette, could you just take a cigarette out of my case and put it in my mouth? And she obliges because she's an idiot, as all villains in these ridiculous sorts of thrillers need to be. And he then informs her, I guess through his cigarette, by the way, so the whole time he must be talking like this through a cigarette, that the cigarette, in fact, is a blow dart that has poison in it. It's like there's a poison arrow that he can then blow through the cigarette to kill her, because I guess he also has incredible aim and really strong lungs on top of everything else.
Well, and apparently those were not filtered cigarettes, because man,
I guess they weren't filtered cigarettes. And she's like, "Oh crap! Oh well, I guess I have to let you go." He's like, "So now you need to undo my handcuffs, or how about just run behind him and be out of the aim of the supposed dart?" This was so bad that I was convinced that at least after the fact, Poirot would admit to Hastings that he had been bluffing, but no. There's no bluffing. That was an actual thing that happened in the story.
It was, in fact, an actual thing that happened. But we should also mention that because these were serialized, each chapter, they're not really, it's not smoothed out like that well. I mean, there are kind of transitions, but there kind of aren't. So each chapter has a marginally self-contained plot, usually involving number 4 offing somebody.
The pattern of these is that it's a mystery puzzle involving a murder, and the culprit at the end is always number 4, and he gets away. And many of the mystery puzzles are clever and pleasing, in the way that Christie short mystery puzzles often are. There was one we wanted to highlight because it's interesting and also a little insane, but clever, and it's one that's also very much highlighted in the adaptation, which we will get to in the Suchet series, and that one is the chess problem.
It's actually pretty clever, if insane. Basically, the setup is two grandmasters were playing chess, an American, Gilmore Wilson, and a Russian, Dr. Svaranov. Mm-hmm. And Wilson died of a heart attack during the game, despite the fact that he was very young and healthy, and Jap and Poirot both obviously immediately think that that's fishy.
It's believed that the intended target was Savarinov, who has a lot of enemies. He fled the Bolsheviks, and he was in fact rumored to have been murdered, but he instead toughed it out in Siberia for a few years to the point where he's now nearly unrecognizable. He's aged so much. And Savarinov is so uncomfortable being in public that he's refused to play chess for an audience in many years. So that is a huge clue, very much in keeping with the traditional Christie clue. If someone is rumored to have been murdered and nearly unrecognizable, it's a pretty sure thing that that person is not that person. There's something fishy going on with Savarinov if he's been out of the public eye and is now not recognizable compared to what he was before. So we should be suspicious of him.
So Poirot and Hastings and Jap go to visit the corpse at the morgue. He has a burn on the finger of his left hand, and amongst his belongings is a white bishop that had been found clutched in his hand when he died as he was about to make his move. We also find out from Jap that he was left-handed. So, dude has a burn on his hand. He died of a heart attack. He died clutching a white bishop in his death grip. Probably those things are related in some way.
This isn't your typical poison case.
So Poirot asks to see the chessboard/chess table, which is very beautiful and covered in inlaid squares, and it's been delivered as a gift only a few weeks previously. He's also finally allowed in to interview Savarinov. Poirot asks him how far into the chess game it was, and could he please have a description of it. Savarinov hesitates. Poirot has to rephrase to ask about the gambit. The Russian then describes it as the Ruy Lopez, a famous opening. So the deduction here, well, there are several. A new table means that the table is there for a reason, murder. And
that reason being murder, yes.
That reason being murder, and no grandmaster would hesitate when asked to describe a game, particularly one only a few moves into a very famous and widely known opening. In other words, the game ended so quickly that even if you knew almost nothing about chess, you would know the first few moves.
Right, so piecing together, our previous deductions about the fishiness of Savarinov, we're now beginning to realize that Savarinov didn't even need more than a rudimentary understanding of chess to play the little bit of chess that had been played in front of an audience. Things are beginning to coalesce, but let's continue. Poirot and Hastings return to their flat, where Jap has left word that Wilson was not, in fact, poisoned. Hastings is also shocked to discover that not only did Poirot not return that beautiful white bishop from the beautiful chess set, he stole its mate to see if they were exactly alike, and they are not. Poirot measures them in a balancing scale and learns that one is heavier than the other, and it's heavier because it has a metal rod in it. And what Poirot then learns after examining the table more closely is that the table was designed to electrocute its player if that bishop with the wire in it landed on a special rigged square. Poirot then asks for a chess book, which for some odd reason Hastings just has on hand.
From South America?
See the Ruy Lopez... Yeah, to see the Ruy Lopez opening. Basically, the Ruy Lopez opening shows that it was entirely predictable which square that bishop with the wire would have been placed on at the point at which Andrew Gilmore did so.
He didn't have to memorize how to play chess for more than 5 moves. That's what's important, because once you get to past a set moves, then he would have to make an in-the-moment decision about chest defense.
And he wouldn't be able to do that because
No.
Savarinoff is, in fact, not Savarinoff. He is number 4, the Destroyer, which is how all of these mystery puzzles end. So there are a whole bunch of these. This is probably the best out of all of them, but there are a whole bunch of these stories. I quite enjoyed the one that hinged on a frozen leg of mutton.
Oh, that one's a good one. And
that
the
was
butcher.
Also enjoyable. Yeah. So, I mean, this story is very readable and it's very enjoyable, the novel overall, because these little short mystery puzzles are quite pleasing. It's just that the way that they are strung together is unconvincing and ludicrous.
Well, there's some suggestion, right, that her brother-in-law actually possibly was helping with the writing of it.
That helped the writing. I mean, the theory that she wrote that she strung this together in the weeks leading up to and perhaps even the days after her infamous disappearance would lend themselves to the idea that she was so out of it that she had her brother-in-law, interestingly, the brother of her estranged husband, this wasn't her sister's husband, this was her husband's brother, help with the writing. If she had actually written it as that book that she burned in the Bodley Head, then perhaps she had a bigger hand in the writing. Maybe he polished it and polished it in a way that she wouldn't have. We'll never know. But yeah, there may be his hand in the actual writing of it as well. Even given the ludicrousness of that overarching plot, there are a couple of things I wanted to point out that I found interesting, and I think you could even use to comment on Christie's work as we've read it thus far. And that is that I think one of the reasons why the overarching story feels so weak is that we never really get a specific sense of what the Big Four's villainous plot really is.
Yeah.
And that's a problem we've come across in a lot of these thriller stories, but I actually think it's at its worst here. For example, in The Secret Adversary, the first Tommy and Tuppence story, Mysterious Mr. Brown had the specific purpose of upsetting the British political order via the Bolsheviks. The colonel in The Man in the Brown Suit was aiding a South African revolution in addition to various other dastardly criminal deeds. In The Secret of Chimneys, King Victor was a jewel thief. These people all had specific things they wanted to do. Here, they're really just bad. At one point, she says that what they want to achieve is the disintegration of civilization, which I don't know. To me, just sounds like what a fourth grader would say when they're trying to say like they're really, really, really bad people. And then much further along in the book, we actually get a contradiction in terms where she tries to spell out what the Big Four actually want to do, and she says these four are banded together to destroy the existing social order and to replace it with an anarchy in which they would reign as dictators. Which I know I'm being a bit pedantic, shocker, but you can't be the dictator of an anarchy. That's like an actual contradiction in terms. And again, it feels a little bit like someone who's just using words to say, like, this is going to be so bad, it's going to be so crazy. And, there's one section toward the end of the book when Hastings pushes back and even, for me, voiced my issues with this, where he says to Poirot, do you really think that the Big Four would be able to devastate the world order and bring about chaos? And Poirot does make the point that the Russian Revolution, which had happened only about 10 years before this book came out, was doing some sort of similar things. And at this point, and even earlier in the book, there are mentions that, Madame Olivier, who is a brilliant scientist, has succeeded in liberating atomic energy and harnessing it to her purpose. So, this is obviously well before the dropping of 2 atomic bombs and all of the mayhem and misery of World War II. It's not like none of this it's not like there aren't uber villains and criminal masterminds and people that can wreak havoc and have wreaked havoc. It's just that it's portrayed in a very unconvincing way throughout for me.
Right. I mean, I guess you can argue that there are like the Julian Assanges of the world who kind of seem to, or in fictional terms, the Joker, right? People who wield an absurd amount of power for a single individual, but basically just want to watch it burn.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, at some level, I guess that is what they're doing. But it's just immensely unclear.
It's immensely unclear, and it's definitely a case of lots of tell and no show, very little to no
Right.
show, which is why it also just, we're never really made to feel that anything is in true jeopardy or anyone's in true jeopardy. And then the other related to that point is the issue that, I was thinking as Christie made that very direct reference to Sherlock Holmes with Poirot's twin brother being, the parallel to Mycroft Holmes. I was thinking about how this book really has a lot of Sherlock parallels, even more than Hastings as Watson, which of course we have in every Poirot book. But
Right.
we also have Countess Rosikoff, who is at least, said to be this criminal mastermind and is very much seems to be filling the Irene Adler role, and that she's, the only woman that Poirot truly admires. But the problem is, and this is also the problem with the Big Four and any of these villains in these Christie books, is that the Holmes canon has Moriarty for this series, and Moriarty is a series-long villain. He's someone who there's continuity to that character, and there's a lot of real dread that Doyle manages to create and keep up around that character. And we just don't have, there's no character like that in these Christie novels, in either the Poirot world or the Marple world or any of the standalones. Whoever the criminals are, they are brought to justice or somehow vanquished and made to, the world order is restored at the end of every single book. And that's not the case with Holmes. And I think Holmes, the Moriarty is a much more effective villain.
Well, he's more effective for a fairly specific reason that I think you can say is a problem across Christie books. In that the big villain here, number 4, he is ultimately an actor, right? And that means that whenever we see him throughout the book, he's in disguise of some kind. And we've had this problem in other Christie books that, she really loves her bad guys wearing disguises. But because it's always a matter of slipping into another character, it's actually in one way more threatening, I suppose, from a real fear of the unknown. But at the same time, part of the reason why Moriarty is terrifying is because you know who Moriarty is.
Yeah. No, that's actually a really good point. I think that the only fear that she's interested in playing on is the fear of the unknown, which goes into the sort of overarching paranoia and kind of conspiracy mindedness of a lot of these thriller stories. Whereas Doyle in the Holmes series was creating a very specific villain who we could be scared of what he actually wanted to do and the kind of person that he was. I think she's really preying upon paranoia and this idea of the upheaval of a world order. And I think, obviously you can fall into the trap, and I'm sure that I am right now to a certain extent, of reading too much into history and having the hindsight of history. But Doyle and Sherlock Holmes was created within compared to the 20th century, a fairly stable social system and world order of Victorian England. And Christie was writing, of course, during the turmoil of the 20th century. And I think she really wants to reassure her readers at the end of every story that no, everything is fine. There is no monster out there. The monster that's been vanquished to a certain extent really is the person who has the ability to shapeshift and be unknown, the person who you don't know what they're thinking. You don't know that they're actually psychotic or a murderer, but we will know by the end because we have good people who are just as powerful for the side of good, like Hercule Poirot and Jane Marple, and everything will be okay. And you can now put the book down and have sweet dreams. And that's kind of the purpose of these books. But when we're supposed to be scared, it just sometimes it's not quite powerful enough for me. And in the mystery puzzles, it's not a problem because the mystery puzzles are not really driven by the fear of that. They're driven just by the cleverness of the mechanics of the plot. But in these books, I think that weakness becomes more apparent.
I think that's fair. Or alternately, I think that there are other spy novels and spy novelists who can pull off a sense of ambiguous dread, but for some reason her need to wrap it up undermines that. If you're going to play on creeping dread and paranoia. You kind of have to just own that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like she never fully commits to it. And
No.
And I also find, and in this book it was more obvious to me than others, but in the Big Four we have number one, the Li Changyan, he represents ingenuity. Mm-hmm. And number two represents wealth or power. That's the American businessman. And number three represents intelligence and sort of wisdom. And all of those things are very powerful notions. And they're in no way who we're supposed to be most afraid of. We're supposed to be most afraid of a freaking actor.
Right.
And the only reason I can think that we're supposed to be afraid of him is because we can't get a handle on him. He doesn't know, this idea of like not knowing one's place or getting uppity and sort of, transcending social class or transcending gender or there's just a lot of these sort of conservatism that's inherent in these Christie stories. Sometimes it's charming. And in the same book, too, it can be charming, but it can also be really problematic.
The conservatism there, I don't even know if it's about social. I mean, it is at some level about social class. It's just, I think in a really bizarre way, when you're talking about somebody who's like most famous detective is an outside foreigner who is essentially a little bit costumed, right? I mean, that's how we recognize him, and that's how in this book he gets away with it at the ending, The idea that if you do not actually present like your proper outside face to the world, that is somehow more dangerous than anything else. Unless you're using it to fight crime, costuming of any kind is somehow suspicious because you are not presenting whatever like the proper version of you is expected to be presented and known to the world.
It's a very paranoid stance that like people who don't sort of expose everything about themselves and who feel that they have anything to hide or anything to be private about, that there must be something wrong with that.
Right.
It's not exactly what she's saying, but there are just elements of that buried in here, and I think buried in a lot of these novels, and in this one it just comes out more so than in others. But in any case, we should probably talk about the adaptation of this novel, because this is an early Christie novel. Even though it's a weird and tricky Poirot, it's an early Poirot. But in the Suchet series, it's an extremely late episode, and boy, is that an important part of the episode. Yeah,
it's one of the last episodes they ever did. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, just as an aside, is that the episode was actually written by Mark Gatiss, Mr. Mycroft Holmes, and co-creator of Sherlock.
Of the whole Sherlock series. And it had a little bit of a the episode was punctuated by those blotches of newspaper headlines that maybe it's just because I knew it was Mark Gatiss, but it felt vaguely Sherlockian to me. It felt very
Sherlockian. Like a lot of it did. And I think in the book itself, I think that Japp's relationship to Poirot takes on more of a Lestrade characteristic than we see in a lot of cases. And
yeah, that's another Holmes parallel. Absolutely. Yeah.
Like we see in this book, like way more than we've seen in other things, that Japp feeds Poirot information and he like gives him cases and hires him as a consulting detective, which we don't really get as clear of a sense of as we do in this book. And I think that also crosses over a little bit into the adaptation, where instead of having Hastings as the partner in solving the crime, it's Japp.
Absolutely. I sort of like that change because we also get so much Poirot and Hastings. It was nice to see Poirot and Japp alone for a bit.
Oh, yeah. I really, I always really liked their relationship on this series. And it had the sense of, and the whole episode, of course, did, because it was meant to, had the sense of seeing old friends.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's the first 10 or 15 minutes, and when what Mark Gatiss chose to do when he adapted this, I think very smartly, given that they were going for this nostalgic, melancholic tone, is that the entire episode is framed around the death of Poirot. So whereas in the book, Hastings only believes that Poirot is dead for 10 pages, 10 out of 200 pages, it's 90% of the episode, or maybe 75% of the episode, and the first 15 minutes are the old crew getting back together to toast Poirot, and Hastings actually chokes up when he tries to think of a toast, and they're all sort of devastated.
Well then, Captain Hastings, a few words.
Really? Me? Oh. Well, I don't really... Hard to know what to say, isn't it? Gosh. My friends.
I know.
To my master, the best of masters.
To our dear friend.
To Monsieur Hercule Poirot.
God rest his soul.
It's funny, too, because there's a bit of an anachronism with how much they've even aged, and this is where I think the series as a television series takes on an importance that trumps the anachronism here, in that the series, as we've said many times, takes place circa 1936. Sometimes it's 1934, sometimes it's 35, 36. And the timeline slowly inches along toward the eve of World War II. And there are a couple of indicators here that set us squarely in 1939. Mm-hmm. So we're actually only 3 years ahead of season 1, which was filmed in 1989, which is 24 years ago.
It was a rough 3 years solving crime.
Yeah, it was a rough 3 years for these people because...
It's really like how they say presidents, age faster than the rest of the population.
Age double.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they aged like what?
Apparently being Mr. Poirot's secretary turns you into an old cat lady, which I also had a little bit of an issue. Like, why is Miss Lemon... She seems to be living alone with a cat.
Well, we only see her for a few minutes. Perhaps there is a husband there.
Perhaps she's Miss Lemon no more, but there's a cat and she's stressing out about the fact that the post comes later and later every day. It didn't seem like she was living the fullest life that I wanted for Miss Lemon. Let's just put it that way. But yeah, so I mean, 3 years have passed within the world of the show, but obviously nearly a quarter century passed from 89 to 2013, and they just go with that, and it's so effective because they look so faded. And oh my god, I don't know. It tugged at my heartstrings. I'll say that.
It tugged at mine too. Jap actually was actually sort of holding up best.
He totally was, and he seemed the least tragic. I mean, he was still married, and he had become assistant commissioner, I think.
In only 3 years.
In only 3 years, exactly. But moving on, the adaptation draws on a lot of the miniature mystery puzzles. They make a lot out of the chess puzzle, which we went through. That's the first one that we get. But the leg of mutton is there. There are a bunch of others.
There's a device that they use with the journalist.
Yeah, the journalist is not in the book. He was annoying, but he was essentially just a consistent catalyst right. to keep things moving along. And there was a lot of simplification, but I think the most interesting thing that was done, and I very much commiserate with them given how much of an issue we both had with how ridiculous the Big Four's villainous plot or lack thereof was, is that there kind of is no villainous plot. Instead of it there being an actual Big Four who were planning world domination / dictatorship of anarchy, this all boils down to number 4, the actor, having an unrequited crush on an actress from 15 years earlier, and he's essentially just trying to impress her. That's what it boils down to. And the other 3 people are not part of it. 2 of the 3 are abducted, the American millionaire and the French scientist, and then drugged. Right. And they're staged at this abandoned theater and made to look as if they're part of this cabal, but they're not. There is no conspiracy. And that, to me, is an improvement, just because I'm sure, I imagine Mark Gatiss read it and said, I think he's even on record as saying that the book is kind of a mess. And by the way, Agatha Christie is also on record. She, in years later, referred to it as, quote, that rotten book, unquote. And I think that had as much to do with the time of her life when it was put out. But she also knew that it was slapped together and it wasn't necessarily her best. So I didn't mind that change, although, I mean, it was a little bit silly that it all really boiled down to an unrequited crush. How did you feel about that?
I mean, it didn't bother me because the book bothered me more.
we should get to the ranking of this novel.
The first category up is plot mechanics.
Yeah. I think that the Big Four might get the lowest score we've ever given a Christie book for plot mechanics, because to me, this is where we know for sure that this was a rush job and not ideal in terms of stuffing a whole bunch of mystery puzzles into a thriller plot that's just not very well done. So we're going to give this a 4 out of 10. Actually, I stand corrected. It is not as low as we've gone. We gave a lower score to Secret of Chimneys, and fair enough. But we're going to go with a 4 out of 10. Yes, Catherine?
Yeah, I agree. So moving on to plot credibility, I'm going to hard pass on this one, because this is...
Hard pass, yeah.
My God, it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a long time, probably too long, complaining about how unconvincing and ludicrous we found this plot to be, so we won't spend any more time. I'd say a 2 out of 10.
Yep. Series-long characters. That's everything good about this book. And, like, it's good stuff. It's, like, charming characterization and, like, good dialogue. And I really liked Poirot's affection towards Hastings, which is more than we sometimes get. And Jap had a bunch of good moments. I was a fan.
Yeah, there are so many really good moments between Poirot and Hastings in particular. I mean, in a series filled with good moments, there were some particularly good moments here, and I just want to read one of them, which is perhaps as bromantic as this pair ever gets. This is when Hastings realizes that Poirot has delivered his wife to safety, and that, you know, Hastings did everything he could to not give away Poirot's location or to lure him to that lair, one of, like, the 80 lairs that people get lured to in this book. So this is Hastings speaking, of course. I turned my head aside. Poirot put his hand on my shoulder. There was something in his voice that I had never heard there before. You like not that I should embrace you or display the emotion. I know well. I will be very British. I will say nothing, but nothing at all. Only this, that in this last adventure of ours, the honors are all with you, and happy is the man who has such a friend as I have. And that ends the chapter. And it's very tender and touching.
It's very touching.
And
can I then on that note point to my other favorite Poirot and Hastings moment?
Of course.
This is Poirot speaking. They've just had another disastrous moment in a series of many of them, and Poirot says, "It was a near thing that, but clumsily, all the same, for I had no suspicion, at least hardly any suspicion. Yes, but for my quick eyes, the eyes of a cat, Hercule Poirot might now be crushed out of existence. A terrible calamity for the world. And you too, mon ami, though that would not be such a national catastrophe. Thank you," I said coldly.
There are just so many good moments, and they're also, I mean, part of the Hastings-Poirot bromance or relationship is, of course, also the gentle ribbing that Christie gives Hastings throughout, even in his own narrative voice. And there are 3 separate occasions on which Hastings is the unwitting rube of Poirot, essentially, where he's set up for a fall and he doesn't realize it until the fall has happened. In one case, Hastings is actually put in a really bad disguise and made to be the personal secretary to the American millionaire. And he only finds out after the fact that Poirot was like, well, of course it was a terrible disguise, and of course he was going to know that it was you. So obviously we really enjoyed Hastings and Poirot in this. This is where I think this book excelled. Let's give the characterization of Hastings and Poirot its due and give them, let's say, an 8?
That sounds good. It's great.
Okay, cool. So next category is book-specific characters. These are pretty bad. I honestly couldn't even... I mean, the Big Four themselves are, except for number 4, forgettable / laughable. I mean, Madame Olivier, who's supposed to be a brilliant scientist, I was never impressed by. Same goes for Abe Ryland. We never even really see Li Changyan. Countess Rosikoff, they keep on saying, is really brilliant, but... I made reference to this earlier. If you actually read the short story where she's referenced, what's interesting is that she's actually an incredibly bad jewel thief, and Poirot catches her really easily. The only reason why he thinks that she's brilliant is that she cops to being guilty really quickly and makes it really easy on him. And this will actually, when we get to Stuck in His Time in a second, this will be useful. So it's worth quoting because it's insane. So from the story, he says, "Mon Dieu, quelle femme! Not a word of argument, of protestation, of bluff. One quick glance and she had sized up the position correctly. I tell you, Hastings, a woman who can accept defeat like that, with a careless smile, will go far." So that's why she's a brilliant woman, because she basically gave up and gave in, which is all sorts of problematic. But so I wasn't even that impressed with Countess Rosikoff. So yeah, the one-off characters really weren't working for me. I don't know. What are you thinking?
Like I don't know, like a 3?
Yeah, I think 3 feels right. I think we actually gave a 3 to the one-off characters in Murder on the Links, which were similarly weak, but not quite as weak as in the Mysterious Affair at Styles. So that feels right to me.
If we're going to talk about setting on tone, on the plus side, we get a lot of setting and a lot of tone. On the downside, those settings include an exploding mountain, leaping out of moving trains, really, really a lot of boats. So in other words, I don't think the setting or tone were good, but they were distinct.
Let's not forget the poison arrow dart in a cigarette.
Who could ever forget that?
They were present, but they were bad. I think that in the Mysterious Affair at Styles, there was a lack of setting and tone, and we gave it a 4. And I kind of think that when you have a setting and tone that are as bad yet present here, it's sort of a wash, and I don't think we should really be rewarding it. But given its presence, perhaps a 4 out of 10, and another 4 out of 10, which is the lowest we've ever given for setting and tone, is appropriate.
I feel like that's fair.
Okay. Certainly that it's a big fall from the 10 out of 10 that we gave The Man in the Brown Suit. So then we come to ways in which this novel is stuck in its own time. The big issue here, our number 1 is a Chinese man. And because of that, there are many references to him and to various Chinamen and henchmen. And they are almost all problematic and terrible and cringeworthy. And there are a bunch of them. And we don't have to go through all of them, but perhaps one of the worst is when Hastings just flat out says, and I'm quoting here, "Not that I had ever succeeded in being able to distinguish one Chinaman from another." That's a direct quote from the book. A little earlier than that, Hastings makes reference to a mind most subtle and oriental, which let's just put aside, obviously Oriental at that time was a fine way of referring to one who was Chinese, even though it's not now. But I don't know I don't know how a mind can have a certain ethnicity. That's just all sorts of ways of offensive. And then I'm not even going to read them out because I don't want to have to be forced to do the voice. But there's a dialogue with a Chinese servant in one of the miniature mystery puzzles that is the most
really cringeworthy.
It's really, really bad. Just take our word for it, or you probably noticed it if you read this one yourself. So just lots of stuff like that. We also, we get the slur for a Chinese person that we've come across before. There's a little bit of the usual isolationism. Hastings refers to somewhat repulsive-looking foreigners. There's some reference to something called a Japanese trick, which I don't even know what that means. And yeah, I mean, otherwise, it's not so bad. There's actually one moment in which Hastings makes an incredibly sexist remark about female scientists. He says, "It has always seemed to me extraordinary that a woman should go so far in the scientific world. I should have thought a purely masculine brain was needed for such work." And it's such a baldly sexist statement that she's clearly sort of making fun of Hastings in that moment. Like, wow, I didn't realize ladies could be scientists. So that was cool. But so my thing is, I don't think this book does great, but there's certainly books that have done worse. I think we were thinking about deducting somewhere around 5 or maybe 4 points.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Like 5. Yeah, either way is fine. It's the Chinese stuff that's just really, really cringeworthy.
Yeah, it's really, really cringeworthy. I mean, I think because I think just for all of that alone, we should give it 4 deductions, and there's really not much else, but like that it is worth 4 solid points.
I'd also say definitely,
deducted.
and also because, I hate to say this, but there's a track record in these books of the exact same thing happening that we've commented on multiple times before.
Yeah. There are certainly books that generally, probably because they're only dealing with white people and with British people, that don't run into that problem. She seems to run into the problem when people of other ethnicities or races or whatever are being depicted.
Particularly Chinese people.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. So let's go with 4 deductions on that. So our final tally for the big 4 is 4 for plot mechanics, 2 for plot credibility, 8 for detective characterization, 3 for one-off characters in the book, 4 for setting and tone, and 4 deductions, which gives us a grand total of 17. And that puts the big 4 in second to last place, just 1 point ahead of The Secret Chimneys. And just to refresh our list here, because it's been a couple of weeks since we did a novel, our current ranking is as follows. In first place, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. In second place, The Man in the Brown Suit. In third place, The Secret Adversary. In fourth place, The Murder on the Links. In fifth place, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. In sixth place, The Big 4, and in seventh place, The Secret of Chimneys.
Well,
so that is our episode. Join us next week for another Poirot short story, this time The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. And in the meantime, you can always email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can follow me personally at Kemper Donovan. You can follow Catherine at Brobcat. You can follow us on Instagram at allaboutthedame. And as always, we urge you to rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're listening to this podcast. See you next time.
See you next week.